Joel, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with Israel, Islam and End Times. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Hey Daniel, it's good to be on with you. Thanks for having me on.
I guess my first question is, which is probably a question that you get asked a lot, with your understanding of End Times from an Islamic perspective, which is certainly proving to be a game changer, considering with everything that has transpired over the past 5 years. For many people, it's like, wow, this actually makes a lot of sense. And everything falls into place just incredibly. How did you come across this? I mean, how did you stumble upon this revelation?
I always try to demystify how I've come to many of the conclusions that I've come to, and try to take it away from the idea that it was some lightning bolt from heaven. You know, my history is, after I came to faith, 1991, very shortly thereafter, a missionary had come to the Pentecostal church that I was attending, South Shore, Massachusetts, and he just laid out the 1040 window, the fact that this is the part of the world where the overwhelming majority of unreached peoples live their lives, and this is where we're not sending missionaries. Now, this was, obviously 20 some odd years ago. But most particularly, he was working among some of the poorest of the poor in Kazakhstan and working with lepers. He was talking about changing bandages and people having maggots. And, this was just, I didn't know that people still existed in the world that still had leprosy, So all of this was new to me. And it was as simple as this. He laid out the fact that the Islamic world needs the gospel more than anyone else, and we are not sending missionaries there. Missionaries are going to all these different island paradises and so forth. And I knelt at the altar, just a young man, had just come to faith, and I said, Lord, before I got saved, I deserved death. I mean, I deserved to be dead, but you saved me. I used to get drunk, pass out in the bushes. I mean, literally. And I said, Lord, I've lived a fairly hard life. I mean, probably not as hard as many others, but if this is what you need, is people to choose an uncomfortable life, I'm happy to do this. And so I had given my life, just simple altar call. I had committed my life to the Islamic world. And so in various ways, at times it was more so than others, but I had been given myself to reach Muslims. Really, since that time, I had moved to the Midwest. I was going to school to pursue a degree that I was going to use eventually to move to the Middle East. This was sort of my 5-year plan. And life happened. I met my wife, kids, and all these different things. I actually have never lived long-term in the Middle East other than when I was a young single guy. I spent most of 94, and that was mostly in Israel. I bounced around a lot between Egypt and Jordan. But after 9/11, I was at the time doing email correspondence with Muslims. They would send in their questions. We would do our best just to answer them. And we started suddenly getting all these emails and questions from people that were not Muslims. They were Westerners, they were Americans, they were Australians, Brits, from all over the world, who were converting to Islam, who had recently converted to Islam, or who were thinking about converting to Islam. I mean, there was just, suddenly, this was the type of email that we were getting. And so it was during this season, for a few years, literally for a few years after 9/11, as I was wrestling with all these people, Westerners, they would join chat forums, they would join these different groups, and they would try to get to know Islam by asking Muslims. That's sort of the way that most Westerners would do it. They don't want to read anything critical. They want to go right to the source, and they're trusting. So they're unaware of the fact that many Muslims that are evangelizing, that are doing dawah in the West, they're presenting a watered-down version of Islam. And so they would go to these forums, go to the mosque, and they were getting their questions answered. And so they would sort of, as one last ditch, they would come. They would say, can you answer these questions? But a lot of them already had their mindset. So it was during this season that I just started really discerning, and it just seemed very clear that Islam a powerfully seductive force. I don't think most Westerners realize the power of the polemic and the apologetic that Islam has. You know, we read about it on the surface and we think it's ridiculous. You know, the Quran's filled with errors and all these different things. But they think the same thing about Christians. And during those years, I found myself giving all the right answers, but people were just falling through my fingers and converting to Islam, and it was disturbing. So, one, I began to discern the truly demonic nature of Islam. The way that in so many ways it really is this counterfeit of biblical faith. And then it was during that time that we started seeing some of the more prominent public beheadings that were appearing in the news. You had, there was a young Korean translator / missionary that was in Iraq that was beheaded, or maybe it was Afghanistan. You had another young guy that was working over there trying to get a business started in the aftermath of Gulf War II. He was publicly beheaded and shocked people. I mean, this was just shocking. So you start looking at some of these little details. Now, I'd always had an interest in the end times, but it was really sort of a peripheral matter. My main focus was reaching Muslims. And so I guess the only way I can say it is during that time, these two things just started coming together and things started clicking. Well, of course, in 2003, 2004 is when I wrote The Islamic Antichrist. It was then called Will Islam Be Our Future? Put it online for free, self-published it, and it struck a nerve. People read it and said, this makes sense, absolutely makes sense. And then, of course, come all of the points of contention. Well, the Antichrist could never be a Muslim because of this or this or this. And so really in the years after that is when I have been able to work through all of these details. But of course, I didn't begin with all of the answers. It was just simply a matter of looking at the scriptures. And I think you will acknowledge, and this is what I came to see, is that when you put Islam, when you plug that in, everything begins to make sense. Everything falls into place. And I am convinced that Islam is the system of the Antichrist, that the Antichrist, his religion, his empire, will come out of the Middle East. I'm convinced of that. But I also want to qualify it and say, but we don't know the future. We're not there yet. We see through a glass darkly, and I'm sure that there are many elements of the story as it unfolds that I will have seen wrongly, and you and I will have seen wrongly, and no one is going to have all of the answers. But I think that we've reached the point where we can say it is reasonable, it is scriptural, and it is sound that this thing comes out of the Islamic world. How it all looks when it's all said and done may be a little bit different than what we imagine now. In fact, I'm sure it will be. But I think it's safe to say that this that is right now in front of us, spreading throughout the world, is that which the prophets saw and declared.
So Muslims are expecting a Messiah-like figure in these last days. Can you tell us some of the most striking parallels that exist between the Islamic Messiah figure and the biblical Antichrist?
With regard to the similarities between the Mahdi, the Islamic Mahdi, and the Antichrist, there's really quite a range of different, what I call anti-parallel similarities, to where their bad guy looks like our good guy and vice versa. But really, when you boil it down, I mean, we can look at all sorts of little details. I spent time, I'm in relationship with some of those that are from Iran. And for instance, they say that at Jamkaran Mosque, this is the mosque where everyone goes, where the well is, where the Shia Muslims believe that the 12th Imam will come back as the Mahdi. And they say there's these hadith that hang, these sort of big tapestries with these hadith, these Islamic traditions, all around the courtyard of the mosque. And they have all of these traditions that say that the Mahdi will come on a white horse, that this is a widely held tradition throughout the Islamic world, but especially so among the Shia in Iran, that he will emerge on a white horse. Well, you know, again, you look at the Bible. In Revelation 6, it says that the Antichrist begins conquering and to conquer on a white horse, that he is portrayed as the rider on a white horse. Now, of course, Jesus is as well. So you have all of these finer details. You have the finer details, such as the fact that most of the Islamic traditions say that the Mahdi will rule for a period of 7 years. Well, of course, the Bible says that the Antichrist will primarily carry out his career, his career on the earth during a period of 7 years. Specifically, the Antichrist will set up his seat on the Temple Mount and usurp, if you will, attempt to cast down the sanctuary of God from Jerusalem. Well, this is exactly where the Islamic prophecies say the Mahdi will establish himself, is on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So you've got these finer details, but really when you boil it down, just in a broad way, the Bible says that the Antichrist will be a religious, military, political ruler. You could focus on any one of those three. You could say he's more religious, or he's more political, or he's more military. But he's all three. And specifically, he's an individual who will set himself up on the Temple Mount, and it leads to this incredible wave of persecution and tribulation against the people of Israel. Well, this is exactly what Muslims are expecting: a religious, military, political leader that will lead Muslims, establish the seat of the Caliph, the Caliphate on the Temple Mount, that he will lead Muslims to conquer Israel. Yes, there are some details between the two that are different, and they don't line up just perfectly, but there are enough similarities to say that there is enough of a satanic hand apparent in the development of these traditions within Islam. Now, again, you can go in and try to dig out these traditions and say, well, this is just borrowed from some Christian pseudepigraphical work, or some Gnostic manuscript in this century. And that's true. These things are not divinely inspired, but somehow we've reached the point where today a vast number of Muslims throughout the world have an end-time belief which is setting them up to receive the Antichrist as if he is their Messiah. And that's the point that people of discernment need to acknowledge. Satan is actively involved in the religion of Islam in setting up Muslims to be deceived. And for this reason, this is not just end times trivia. This has profound missiological implications. This has profound implications with regard to the gospel. We need to be praying for Muslims. There is a powerful system of prophecy that has blinded them, and we need to be crying out and saying, Lord, this is a powerful deception, but greater is he that is in us. You are far greater than this deception. Break the blinders, remove the veil from their eyes, help them to see, even as you've helped us to see. And so this has to be more than just end-time trivia. This has to be an issue that drives us to our knees so that we are praying for Muslims, that they could see the truth, they could see that they've been set up, and they could see the truth regarding the God of the Bible, and come into relationship with him, and many of them are. So we can pray with confidence when we pray for these things.
Some critics of this position would say that it's only a small minority of Muslims that actually believe in this Mahdi or 12th Imam. How do you respond to that?
Obviously, there's a lot of critics of the theory that the Antichrist could be a Muslim. And one of the things that a lot of people say is that no one's expecting the Mahdi, just a few, just a minority, or just the Shia. But it's simply not true. It's simply not true. And really, those that continue to make that statement, either one, they're truly ignorant, or they're purposefully being misleading. You can go down the list. You can quote every single one, all four of the primary Sunni madhabs. These are the leaders of the Sunni schools of jurisprudence: Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, Hanafi. They all reference the Mahdi. They all believe in the Mahdi. You can, the various writers of tafsir and the early commentators on the Qur'an, all of the classic scholars of Islam, whether it's Sunni or Shia, reference the Mahdi and say that this is valid belief for Muslims. And so it really is widespread. Now, that doesn't mean that every single Muslim you meet believes these things, just like every Christian you meet doesn't necessarily believe in the Antichrist. But is belief in the Antichrist orthodox, basic, standard biblical Christianity? Yes. Just like belief in the Mahdi is widespread throughout the Islamic world. And it's found throughout the Hadith. I mean, there are references in all of the various collections. So The critics that say it's not widely held, they simply don't know what they're talking about. And it's really beyond dispute.
Again, other critics will come and say that the Antichrist cannot be a Muslim because we know that the Antichrist will demand worship. And we know that a Muslim will never do that because he will only worship Allah. How do you get around this? How will this Muslim Antichrist demand worship, even though it's against the tenets of their religion for him to do that?
So probably the most significant bone of contention that people have with the idea that the Antichrist could be a Muslim is the notion that the Antichrist proclaims himself to be God. The problem with that is that no one ever asks, what God does he proclaim himself to be? People just say, well, he proclaims himself to be God. But the scriptures are clear. Daniel 7:25, Daniel 8:11 through 13, Daniel 11:36 through 39, Revelation 13, it says that the Antichrist will blaspheme the Most High. He will speak out against the Most High. He will say unheard of things against the God of gods. So you can't say that on one hand he proclaims to be the God of the Bible, but speaks blasphemies against the God of the Bible. He mocks and says unheard of things against the God of the temple. I think a much more reasonable, fuller explanation of this reality is when we look at Daniel 8:13, again Daniel 11:36 through 39, that when we look at all of these texts, we see that the Antichrist will set himself up in the temple of God. He will magnify himself, proclaiming himself to be equal to the commander of the host, equal to, greater than the God of gods. And so it is the very act of sitting himself in the temple that is the act of proclaiming himself to be superior to the God of the Bible. It doesn't say in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4 that he proclaims himself verbally to be God. It doesn't say that, but yet if you read most of the writings of most popular Christian folks that are into the end times, teaching on the end times, they will say that he proclaims himself to be God. It does not say that in the text. Most Christians, what they do is they simply read the writings of Paul. They read Paul's words, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. They say the Antichrist proclaims himself to be God, and then they impose that assumption back into the book of Daniel. Whereas Paul would have begun with Daniel and then expounded upon what Daniel had written. And so really when we look at the full spectrum of what the scriptures teach about the Antichrist, it says that he has a God. In Daniel 11, right in there about 39, right in there, it says that he has a God of forces that he honors, that he pays tribute to with silver, gold, costly stones, this sort of thing. So how can he claim to be God but also have a God? I think that a fuller understanding of all of the relevant texts would teach us that the Antichrist will essentially claim to be a representative of God, but it is the God of forces, the God of fortresses, or the God of war that he worships. And he will extract worship, if you will, for this God as this representative on the earth. Now, there may be a time in the Antichrist's career where this changes, where he goes through a transformation. We need to leave room for that possibility. But we need to be very careful in assuming that he proclaims himself verbally to be God, because it's contradictory to other passages. And I think that when we look at all of the relevant data, there's a much stronger case that he is a blasphemer of God, but he is directing people's worship to his God. And that's the one that the Bible calls the God of forces or fortresses, or as I said, a God of war. We could say a God of jihad.
In your best-selling book, Islamic Antichrist, that you wrote back in 2006, you actually said, or you predicted, that the Islamic Caliphate would be reformed. And that exactly happened, and it happened before our eyes in March last year, in 2014. Is this something that you were taken by surprise when you saw it happening, or did you fully anticipate it?
My book, Islamic Antichrist, was actually self-published in 2006, but it was actually written in 2004 and put online all the way back there. So it's interesting. Now when I go back and I look at this book that's now 11 years old, And I declared, based on my reading of the scriptures, that there would be a revived caliphate. And it has happened. There's no question about that. I have, a chapter where I deal with the army of black flags that would come. We've seen that happen. I wrote about the beheadings, and this was really a new thing back then. Now we see it in the news every day. I mean, we actually have beheading fatigue. It's such a common thing. All of these things I did not write because I'm a prophet. I didn't have a vision from heaven. I simply did my best to expound what the scriptures say. And that more people would do that they would peer into the prophets. Now, for clarity, yes, there has been a caliphate that has been formed with ISIS. However, I don't believe that is the final caliphate. I don't believe that thing's going to metastasize and spread out across the earth. I believe that it will be subsumed, that it will essentially be crushed, and another greater caliphate will replace it. When we look at some of the descriptions of the Antichrist, it says that he will arise during a time of tranquility, when people feel secure. And so between now and the emergence of the Antichrist and his rise to power, there's going to be a period of peace, of false peace, a period of false tranquility, where people's sense of insecurities will be put to rest. And it's during this time that the Antichrist rises and is able to engage in this 7-year covenant or treaty with Israel that Isaiah refers to as the covenant of death. So I think that we can say that the ISIS caliphate is probably something that is temporary, and that something much greater that will begin seemingly moderate, seemingly peaceful, will eventually replace the caliphate. But nevertheless, they mocked Bush, they mocked Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, all these guys for even using the term. I mean, they scoffed at them as just right-wing fanatics, Glenn Beck. And yet the fact of the matter is that it has taken place. It has taken place. Several years ago, former Vice President Al Gore was declaring that by this time, the polar ice caps would have already completely melted. Okay, that obviously has not happened. But before that time, I was declaring that there would be a caliphate reestablished. It has happened. Again, it's not because I'm a prophet, but it's because the scriptures make these things clear. And so I think that we can look at the scriptures and say there's much more that has yet to be fulfilled. Let us turn to these things. Let us peer into these things. They've been given to us. Behold, Jesus said, I have told you beforehand. And I think it's time that the church stops neglecting this tremendous treasure chest of information that the Lord's given us, and that we turn to it in a responsible and careful manner.
What are your thoughts on Turkey's role in the Middle East, especially with what we're hearing with Turkey actually providing support for Islamic State, and actually, as we've seen in the news, they've been bombing the Kurds? What are your thoughts on that?
Let me just say this briefly. Turkey has a tremendous amount of nationalism that exists within Turkish society, particularly among the more conservative, among the more Islamist-oriented. If they are what they pretend to be, which is more democratic and moderate and modern, then they would be opposed to ISIS. They would be opposed to the barbaric nature of ISIS, but instead they are basically letting ISIS by. Yeah, there's a few, an airstrike here or there for show, but for the most part, their main enmity exists between Assad, who is a pawn of Iran, as well as the Kurds, because Turkey doesn't want the Kurdish people to establish a stronghold in northern Iraq or Syria, because if they do, they think that will become the base that they will launch attacks into Turkey. And Turkey's not willing to give up a shred of the Republic of Turkey. Even though these areas are dominated by a majority of Kurdish people, and by all means they deserve to have their own nation, Turkey believes that it's their destiny, their divine destiny, to rule the whole Middle East. This Turkish superiority attitude, really, it dominates the thinking of the AK party, the politicians that run Turkey. And so it's no surprise that they're really letting ISIS slide and they're bombing the Kurds, they're attacking Assad, and they are propping up ISIS in their war against Assad, against the Kurds, against Hezbollah, and ultimately against Iran, because it's really two alpha dogs, Iran and Turkey, that are contending for the heart of the nation, and that conflict is only going to continue to explode in the days ahead.
Well, Joel, we're certainly living in unprecedented times at the moment, and with everything that's happening, would you be of the opinion that the church is asleep?
There's no question that much of the church is asleep, and there's no question that much of the church needs to wake up. The problem and the danger is that these things most often happen when God sends a national calamity, or he sends global catastrophe, that through pain people wake up. And that's a good thing. That can be a good thing. The danger is that many people, when they wake up, they do so really out of fear. They're afraid of losing their stuff. They're afraid of losing their comfort. They're afraid of losing the world around them that they love. And so then what they do is they react out of fear and hatred. And they hate Muslims. They feel like Muslims are taking away their stuff, their world. Or they hate those, from a political party that they feel is destroying their nation. And so they eventually, basically, they give themselves over to hatred. But what the Lord wants is for us to wake up so that we become more prayerful, right? The Lord wants us to be sober for the purpose of prayer, but most of all, that we would have love, that we would have passionate love for one another and for the lost, because that's his heart. And so oftentimes, as the world is melting down around us, I'm convinced that what many people claim is this righteous indignation, what it actually is it is a rage born out of fear of losing the world that they love. The Lord said that we're not to love the world. We're to have our eyes fixed on the age to come. We can love the earth, the planet, but by the term world is referring to this present system, this present wicked, corrupt system. And our stuff, and people are in love with their stuff and their world and their comfort. And when they see it being taken away, they react in anger toward others that they feel are taking it away. And it's often expressed as a righteous indignation, but often it's actually, as I said, a rage-born fear. We need to let go of this world, die to this world, and then when the world melts down around us, we're not afraid. But we do need to wake up to what's taking place throughout the world in terms of radical Islam. There's no question about it. And yes, because of political correctness, many people are choosing to put their head in the sand and be the proverbial ostrich. I believe that the way to wake the church up is through prayer, is that when we give ourselves to prayer, then we're connected to God. Then he communicates what we need to be urgent about. And ultimately, all these things lead back to the gospel, right? So it's about preparing to win souls. It's not about preparing to preserve our lives. The preparation without the cross at the center of who we are is basically a refusal to embrace the cross. We need to put the cross first, and then all preparation will flow out of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to have a gospel-centered focus in these last days.
And this question is a fairly big question, because it's a question that the church has to wrestle with. I mean, the church has a responsibility to be a watchman, but also has a responsibility to be a lifesaver in saving souls. How do you balance the responsibility of the church to warn people about the dangers of Islam that we're facing at the moment, particularly in the West, while at the same time, how do we reach out to the Muslim with love and compassion? How do we do that?
The thing of it is, and this is something that bothers me, is that I find right now the present atmosphere in many churches is that on one side you have the kind of churches that will welcome Islam in. They'll come in and have kumbaya meetings and kind of say we all worship the same God, and just give themselves over to compromise, and they think they're being loving and kind. It's like the gospel has no call to repentance. It has no clear exclusivity or hard line. It's just the gospel of being nice. If we're just nice to everybody, we've somehow fulfilled our duty. So you've got that side, which is, in my opinion, well-intentioned, but just completely a mess. And then on the other side, the majority of churches today, this is what I have found as traveling and speaking all over the world, is that if you want to put on a seminar, you want to come in and you want to say Islam is bad, Islam's going to destroy the country, the Muslims are all, by and large, terrorists, they're all colonizers, they're trying to take over your country, they want to destroy freedom, they don't care, all they want is Sharia, all this kind of thing. Churches will welcome that in. If you come in and say, we need to be politically active, we need to petition members of Congress, this, that, and the other thing, they will welcome that in. But if you want to put on a seminar about how to love Muslims, how to embrace the cross, proclaim the gospel, proclaim the love of Jesus to Muslims while holding the line that you need to repent and believe in Jesus, most churches are not interested. I mean, it's a small sliver of churches that are interested. And so if I'm to be honest, I find that by presenting the biblical understanding of Islam, the fact that Islam is demonic, that is actually what opens the door that gets me into a lot of churches to where I can then give people the proper application, which is gospel application. Because the bottom line is, if I'm going in and I'm warning people about the role of Islam in the end times, how Islam is satanic, and then I leave it at that, it's going to leave people scared, and they're not going to be equipped to respond properly, and they're probably going to respond in a way that's based on fear, and even lead them into hatred. And I would have that's a profound responsibility. I would be held accountable before the Lord for that. But if you come in and you tell the truth about Islam, and then you say, but as Christians, this is our response. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be politically active. I believe in political activism. But as Christians, our priority should be to proclaim the gospel, because that's the only way that's going to change anything. It's the only way that we're going to change anything. The method of Jesus is you change the world one heart at a time from the inside. It's not an external legal imposition trying to change people who are unrighteous. It's an internal change from within, and it transforms a person who then preaches the gospel to other people, and eventually an entire society is transformed. And when we get a hold of the gospel, there is some hard challenges and calls within the gospel, and that's to lay down our lives for our enemies as we imitate our Father, who sent his very essence, his very Son into the world, to lay down his life for us, who were his enemies, and then he calls us to imitate him. And so for me, this is just Gospel 101. This is basic Christianity, and I do ask for your prayers in the weeks and months ahead that more churches would be open to the basic biblical Gospel 101, and that the church would wake up, not just to the threat of Islam, but to our need to respond to Islam in a way that properly represents Christ.
Joel, thank you so much for agreeing to be on Israel, Islam and End Times. We really appreciate it. And your answers have been thoroughly engaging and absorbing, and will certainly help to clarify a lot of the questions that we do have, especially with what we're seeing happening in the world at the moment. And we will certainly hope that you would join us on this program again in the future. So Joel, thank you so much once again. God bless you.
So thanks for having me on with you, Daniel. It was a blessing to be with you.